YouTubers can be a superstitious bunch. On your way up, you don't really know what makes your videos successful and what makes them underperform, so you tend to listen to advice from people who seem to know what they're doing. One piece of advice I've heeded lately is to come up with a compelling title and thumbnail idea before even recording the video. In this case, after some laborious testing, I did have to go back and add a question mark. History time. Way back in the 1990s, Intel discovered something called marketing. This new way of talking about their products made them seem more compelling and exciting for consumers, and so the follow-up to their 286, 386 and 486 processors was branded Pentium. This came as something of a shock to companies like Cyrix and AMD, who had quite reasonably been preparing their own competing products to be called variations on the theme of 586, because even in the 90s, AMD's primary business was trolling Intel. Meanwhile, brandishing their new marketing weapon like a kid with his dad's gun, Intel's Pentium series went on to become a huge and reliable sales success for years to come. Until it wasn't. After about a decade of Pentiums, Pentii, Intel had run their flagship onto the shore and was still trying to turn the rudder, whereas their core brand mobile chips came to represent the future of the company's desktop line. The Pentium brand became associated with poor instructions per clock and high temperatures. From then on, the name Pentium having lost most of its positive connotations with consumers, the label was attached to products slightly above the worst of the worst. For the 20th anniversary of the Pentium name, however, Intel got a bit sentimental. They decided to mark the occasion with a fancy new model, one designed to embody the spirit of the best of the PC enthusiast scene. It would be cheap, it would be pretty minimal in terms of specs, but it would overclock like a beast. Thus was born the Pentium Anniversary G3258. Sounds impressive, right? Well, as a Haswell refresh chip, codenamed Devil's Canyon, the G3258 was built on the company's flagship 22nm architecture, with improved thermal interface material and an unlocked multiplier that would work even on some of the more economical motherboards like the B85 series. So far, so good. However, what Intel didn't want to do was actually make a Pentium that was competitive with their Core series. So while you could cheerfully overclock your new Pentium to 4.5 GHz or higher, you might find it still doesn't do much. The chip has 2 cores but lacks hyperthreading, a feature popularised by the Pentium 4. Moreover, while the Haswell Core series was gaining the AVX2 instruction set, which helps it remain relevant even today, the G3258 doesn't even have AVX1. All in all, I can't help but feel like this was a mixed message from Intel. On the one hand, this little CPU looks like an overclocker's dream, and yet even overclockers usually want to be able to do something with their CPUs once they've had their nasty way with them. To find out more, I installed my chip onto an Asus Z97 Griffin motherboard, dropped a Zaman tower cooler on top, and paired it with 16 gigs of DDR3 2400. Overclocked to 4.7 GHz at 1.35 volts, 4.8 crashed even at over 1.4 volts, and matched with a very overkill RTX 3070, I was ready to see what the G3258 was capable of. This didn't go very well. I have 10 titles in my test suite. 4 didn't start. 4 were among the most painful gaming experiences I've had lately. 1 did fine until you looked at the screen, and 1 was Civ 6. Let me quickly address the games that couldn't make it. Battlefield 5 wouldn't start, even with the DX11 flag enabled. Cyberpunk flatlined, Red Dead Redemption 2 failed to redeem itself, and Witcher 3 Remastered did this. With the party poopers out of the way then, here are the benchmarks for the games that did start. So, I'm not great at Valorant, but I'm not terrible. My reactions are okay, but my aim's a little off sometimes. I do, however, rely on smooth frame delivery and, of course, sound. Sound is how you track where your opponents are, after all, and the game is pretty hard to play if you can't hear what's happening around you. Well, in what will become something of a theme, the G3258 managed to desynchronize the sound from the video by a lot. Like several seconds. More than several, like a lot of seconds. Of course, not everyone's playstyle is the same, so maybe you don't need the sound to sync up in order to enjoy yourself. Well, I'm betting you'd like a CPU that doesn't induce multiple seconds long freezes in gameplay, often right at the critical moment, and on one occasion sending me clipping through the scenery and sticking in place until someone killed me again. The 124 FPS average might look tempting, but trust me, even the 10p i3 is a better time. Unsynchronized audio is annoying in single-player games, but it's a particular problem in multiplayer, and of course it just so happens that Fortnite suffers from the exact same problem as Valorant did. Half a minute passes between firing a gun and the gunfire sound playing, and multiple seconds long stutters pervade the gameplay experience. Unlike Fortnite's standard stuttering issues, this carries on even after several matches. Microsoft Flight Simulator started. Yeah, I was surprised too. But having seen something similar on an i5 recently, I wasn't all that shocked. If you look closely, you'll see that this is actually the N64 version of the game, with polygons and textures that are just about enough to fit on a 1990s console cartridge. New York City is pretty unrecognisable. I could say that the G3258 recorded a near 50 FPS average, and that this is surprisingly playable, but I don't want to give the CPU too much credit. The game had to turn NYC into Bubsy 3D to achieve it. Spider-Man Remastered also started. Well, hang on. It started with RT disabled. Trying to boot the game with RTX on resulted in a crash, and trying to enable it while in-game had the same result. With RT off, though, I could have myself a thoroughly terrible time swinging along Broadway. In a few previous videos, low-spec machines have caused the game to pause for a moment while things loaded into memory, and to be fair to it, that didn't occur on the G3258. Though, at a few points you can see assets loading in only a short distance from the player, so I guess it's not impossible that it might still occur, given long enough. The average looks playable, but it's the ones and the point ones that tell the story. Elden Ring once more fails to get its act together with regards to audio and video synchronicity, and though this is perhaps less critical than in multiplayer games, it's still not ideal. Neither is playing with this amount of stutter. Once more, the average might suggest to you that, hey, the game's not completely unplayable, but the lows are telling a different story, and that story is, buy a better CPU. Civ 6 manages an average turn time of 9.31 seconds, more than a second slower than a Sandy Bridge i7, but still faster than a Sandy i3. So, I was tempted to leave it there. There's no way I'm recommending this crap to anyone. And if you have one right now, I'd suggest picking up an i5 ASAP. The 4400s and 4500s can be picked up very cheaply, and even the overclockable models aren't that expensive these days. You might even find a good deal on an E3 V3 Xeon, some of which are equivalent to i7s, but without iGPUs. That being said, I didn't want to leave the review half-baked, so I thought it might be a good idea to look back at some of the games that were more of its era. No, I guess it wasn't a good idea, now that I come to think of it. I remember some years back seeing someone, it was either Budget Bill's Official or TechWen, reviewing a Sandy Bridge i3 and having pretty much the same experience as this in GTA 5. The game occasionally forgets to render the ground, or else it renders slightly too much of it, and the game runs like a three-legged mule. Even with VSync enabled, the game is brutally, almost comically unplayable. Averages hit 44, which you'll notice is much lower than the numbers in the Afterburn overlay, but the single-digit 1% lows are dragging the whole thing down. But can it run Crysis, that 2007 game famous for its demand for single-thread performance? The one that advertises an Intel Core 2 quad at the beginning? Funnily enough, no. Even at 1080 medium, things are embarrassingly unstable. I tried rebooting the system, disabling Spectre and Meltdown protections, lowering the overclock, and still saw nothing better than single-digit 1% lows. If ever there were a damning indictment of the G3258, this is it. It cannot run 2007's Crysis. So, it's not all bad news. Even if it can't run famously well-optimised games like GTA 5 or 15-year-old games like Crysis, it can at least run some things. CSGO is useful for benchmarking CPUs, but it's not necessarily that demanding on them. At 1080 low, the Pentium can manage a surprising 113 FPS on average, and although 1% and 0.1% are still less than ideal, they weren't game-breaking. I would challenge the idea of there being any such thing as a casual CSGO player, merely an ex-CSGO player waiting to happen, but for those of you who haven't given up yet in frustration, the G3258 could help you work through the process. Fall Guys is another game that doesn't usually make its way into my test suite, but I was running out of ideas for games that might work and that anyone would actually give a shit about in 2023. The experience was not awful but not remotely smooth, averaging 130 FPS but dropping way down into the 30s. Turning on VSync actually helps dramatically, lifting the 0.1s to almost 30 FPS, up from just over 10 FPS when uncapped. Hades was briefly my addiction around the end of 2021, but now that I've finished the story, I think I'm finally moving on with my life. I didn't get round to testing with VSync enabled, and it's possible that might make the experience a bit smoother, but in fairness, I didn't notice any terrible stutters while playing. The 308 FPS average is, of course, ridiculous. The game will be quite playable at a fraction of that, so feel free to enable VSync or use an FPS cap in RevaTuner. What am I saying? Don't buy the f***ing CPU. So, there we have it. In the days where games had to be developed to run on PS4s, Xbox Ones, and Wii U's, there might have been room for something as weak as the G3258, but frankly, those games would run just as well on a locked Haswell i5, and that CPU would do significantly better in everything that the Pentium failed so miserably at. The G3258 was a short-sighted product in 2014. Today it's a letter opener, or a keyring, or a socket protector, or anything but a good CPU. Next week I'll be looking at another much better Haswell. In the meantime, thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.